Rangeland managers throughout the world now are challenged with not only managing grazing and fire and wildlife on landscapes, but also do that in light of invasive plants that largely weren't there native naturally, but for some reason are causing challenges and increasing in abundance. So today in integrated rangeland management, we're going to talk about the principles of invasive plant management, and I'm going to distinguish between some terms that are relevant to plant management. So who cares? Who cares about the spread of invasive plants across natural landscapes? In this case, we're going to talk mostly about rangelands. But basically, everybody cares, or should care. There's been a lot of work over the last few years trying to make sure that people are aware of invasive weeds and the role that they play. They signal a decline in the natural ecosystem at a watershed scale. So anyone that lives or works or cares about any watershed needs to think about invasive plants. They impact a wide range of ecological services and benefits of land, from beauty to biodiversity to economic benefit. They affect people who manage land, rural, private landowners, state, federal land managers, but also people who live in cities, so both urban and rural residents are affected. So they affect a wide segment of society. So they spare nobody who uses, loves, makes a living on land. Be ranchers, farmers, fishermen, hunters, cyclists, anyone who uses or manages lands needs to be aware of and cognizant of the role that weeds could play in that land health and integrity. And the final point to make is, with invasive plants, you can't leave well enough alone. You can't just step away and say, let Mother Nature take her course, because what invasive plants have done in many ways, they've changed the rules. And if they're left unmanaged, they will spread usually rapidly, unceasingly, and silently across the landscape. There may be some cases where reducing specific uses of the land will benefit the ecosystem and reduce weeds, but most often, once invasive plants are in the system, you can't leave well enough alone. I'm going to talk mostly about invasive plants and invasive species as plants, but I want you to remember there's a whole lot of invasive species out on the land that are more than just plants. There are invasive animals. Can you think of some invasive animals? Things like fire ants could be invasive. Any insects that move across and increase would be invasive. What about microbes, including fungi, bacteria, etc.? Blister rust, that's a problem on pines, would be an example of a microbe. What about viruses? Viruses and diseases. The one that comes to mind for me is West Nile virus, which really was never native to North America, but has really wreaked havoc on animals that live out on the wildlands. So I'm not going to touch on anything but plants today, but if you want more information on other invasive species that occur in North America, visit the Invasive Species Council website, which is www.invasivespecies.gov. It's a great website. Let's clear up some terminology before we go much further. I tend to use these terms relatively casually. I'll try to be careful because there is a distinction between weeds, noxious weeds, whole set of terms that mean the same thing: exotic, alien, introduced, and non-indigenous, and invasive plants. So let's distinguish between those terms over the next few slides. First of all, weed, that's the most commonly used term. It just basically means a plant that's of little value. Anyone can look at a plant and say, oh, that's a weed. It usually is best thought of as a plant that's out of place. So, we often talk about a plant in your garden might not be what you want out in your pasture, or vice versa. A beautiful plant like alfalfa in the pasture may be great, but in the garden it would be out of place and be considered a weed. So the placement of where the plant is and when it occurs is important. More specifically, in agriculture, we think of weeds as species that compete with crops or native species out on the rangelands. They're troublesome. They can cause trouble ecologically, but also think about the fact that weeds are often plants that cause trouble for health and any other level of productivity of the landscape, including biodiversity and other natural processes on the land. So the book definition, one of the best books that I know of is this Applied Weed Science, came out in 1999 by Ross and Lemby. Their definition is plants that interfere with the growth of desirable plants and that are usually persistent and pernicious. They negatively impact human activities in such a way that they are undesirable. So a simple definition encompasses a lot of the aspects of weeds. Noxious weed is a segment of weeds that is very specific. Yeah, in general, noxious just means something that's deleterious, and all weeds are deleterious by definition. But noxious in the case of weeds has a very specific meaning. It comes from the Noxious Weed Law, the Noxious Weed Act of 1974, which created noxious weed laws that are used across the West. And in this case, noxious has a very specific meaning. Once a plant is declared a noxious weed by a county, region, state, or even nation, then there's new rules that apply. So here's some of those new rules that came into effect under the Noxious Weed Act. The Act requires that local and state and federal agencies designate adequately trained people to oversee the weed program. It requires that there be a budget for weed control. The budgets were set at national and state levels, but many counties and local groups have followed suit and also have weed budgets. Individuals must control weeds on their land or they face fines. That means the government needs to control their weeds to the best of their ability and finances, and we on our private land also need to control weeds. If you have an active county weed supervisor, an active weed agency in your county, you can have liens put against your property if you don't control weeds. The county will come in and control them, and they can put a lien against your property. At least in Idaho and many western states, that's the case. And then finally, the Noxious Weed Act really encouraged that there be cooperative agreements among landowners, because weeds are something that do not respect land boundaries. So the Noxious Weed Act set up procedures for coordinated weed management units, so that allowed the federal government to share resources with local and county folks. So the initial act did apply to federal lands, but has now also gone to apply in state lands. Most states have noxious weed laws, and also do most counties. I'm going to use Idaho as an example. I know that not everyone in this class is from Idaho, but our noxious weed laws are actually quite progressive, and many states have followed our lead. So in Idaho, we have 64 different species of weeds that are designated under our noxious weed law, and they are designated by a group of people that review the list every year and decide what should or should not be on the list, and that's the Noxious Weed Council that does that. That council and the weed actions are managed in Idaho under our State Department of Agriculture. Now that varies from state to state, but many states' departments of agriculture oversee noxious weed actions, as they do in Idaho. To get on the noxious weed list in Idaho, there's a certain set of criteria that a plant has to meet. Again, these are similar to other states, but in Idaho, a plant must be present but not native to Idaho. We don't have any plants on the noxious weed list in Idaho that are not native to Idaho. That are native to Idaho. So all of the plants on our list are from somewhere else. It must be potentially harmful to Idaho, and it has to be more harmful than beneficial. So we'll talk later about some beneficial aspects of weeds, but in this case, they have to be more harmful than beneficial. Another interesting one is that eradication has to be possible. It has to be economically and physically possible. So, for example, in Idaho, cheatgrass is often considered a weed, a terrible weed, a really widespread weed. Well, cheatgrass is not on the noxious weed list because it's so widespread that it could not be economically and physically eradicated from the state. And again, eradication means completely removed. Another final point is that the potential adverse impacts of the weeds have to exceed the cost of control. So the level-headed people in Idaho who put this law together said, you know, we're not going to put lists on here. So there's just the cost of control is so high that the weed is not as bad as the cost of control. To learn more about the people in charge of our noxious weed actions in Idaho, you can go to oneplan.org, and then that's in the crop division and the noxious weed division. So follow that link on the screen here. Another aspect that was initially true in Idaho's Noxious Weed Law, but has changed now. It is true in many other laws, but the idea that weeds are not all the same. And I think it's a really important concept that any county or state or even the federal government might say, well, some weeds are on this list that really requires really early detection and rapid response. So many states have, and Idaho used to have an EDRR list, early detection rapid response list. This is where when a plant is found, everything is done possible to eradicate that plant. Get the people out there, make sure the identification is right, go back and monitor the location so that basically to stop weeds before they really get a foothold. Another set of invasive plants or weeds would be in what would be called a control level. When they're found, it's necessary to control them and try to eradicate them locally. And finally, the last set would be ones that are in such large distribution, and the goal of those would be containment. So, for example, yellow star thistle is really widely spread across northern Idaho, and it's on the containment list. It's the people south of us that don't have very much really try to contain it and keep that boundary of yellow star thistle from moving any further south. So whether it's a part of your law or not, I think it's important to think about weeds as being at least in these three separate categories: early detection and rapid response, control, and containment. The spread of these weeds and the damage they cause can be lessened if there's proper identification and handling of these weeds. So based on this real need to have proper identification, Idaho and many states and counties have great weed identification books, such as this one in Idaho, which is called Idaho's Noxious Weeds. It's in its 5th edition. It covers all 64 of the weeds. There also is an insert that you can purchase, or often comes with this book, that talks about chemical control, chemical options, biocontrol options. And though it's focused mostly on identification, it does give some ideas of what control options there are. This website on the bottom would take you to an online link to this, or an opportunity to purchase this book. It was created by a group of scientists and outreach specialists with the Idaho Extension, University of Idaho Extension. So it's a great book, to check it out. Okay, now let's go to a whole set of terms that all mean the same thing. They all mean the plant didn't come from here. It's not from around here. It came from somewhere else. It's not native to this region, but it was brought here from somewhere else, either accidentally or on purpose. And those sets of terms would be exotic, alien, introduced, and non-indigenous. In Idaho, there are about 3,000 plants. 800 of those are exotic weeds, and 100 or so of those would also be considered exotic or alien, but would be introduced crops and ornamental plants. So, although I don't know exactly how many introduced crops and ornamental plants there are, I suspect we're pushing about 1,000 introduced and alien, exotic plants that would all be considered non-indigenous or not native to Idaho. So how did these plants get here? I said that they came either on purpose or by accident. One thing for sure, that the human actions are the primary means or the primary way that invasive species are introduced to a region. They might have been accidentally part of grains or feed. One thought about how cheatgrass got here is that it was accidentally in some grain and some hay. Ship ballast and shipping contents and shipping crates is also another way that plants may have come across the ocean and found a foothold in North America. Ornamental plants, many weeds are beautiful, and they came here for ornamental reasons, such as leafy spurge, believe it or not, was believed to have ornamental value, so it was brought here. Also, salt cedar, brought here as an ornamental plant. Erosion control, was also, the government introduced plants that are really good at maintaining soils, such as reed canary grass, and also smooth brome, I believe, was brought for erosion control, because these are two plants that have rhizomes, so they're sod forming, and they can really hold the soil, and they can also take over a site. And certainly up here in northern Idaho, reed canary grass has really taken over and just become monocultures along the small streams that we have. So erosion control is important, but invasive plants can be a result of bringing new plants in to solve one problem. Forage value, many plants were brought in for forage value, intermediate wheatgrass, smooth brome, a few others that were brought in because they were good forage, and then they keep moving out. Forage kochia is one that's still kind of in the news because people would like to use it for fire control, and it was brought in as a forage plant, but there's concern that it might become invasive. Another kind of side point, spotted knapweed, which is also pictured here on this graph, was said to be brought to the area around Missoula, Montana, which is it's a really dominant plant on those hills around Missoula now. It was believed it was introduced there as a honey, for pollen for honey bees. So a lot of different reasons that plants are brought here, accidental and or on purpose. So what's an invasive plant then? Invasive plant has specific characteristics that of course make it invasive. Once it's established, it can outcompete the native plants and often spread to dominate whole wildland plant communities. And once they get to a completely dominant state, we often call it a monoculture. It's only one plant, and that can happen with invasive plants. They exhibit weedy or aggressive growth characteristics. We'll talk about what those are in a minute. And they can be grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees. Every growth form of plant has some invasive members to it. They can be native or exotic. Most of the ones that we'll talk about, especially as being bad, are those invasive plants that are exotic, that are not from around here. But some plants can be problematic and invasive even although they're native, and juniper in the southwestern Idaho and southeastern Oregon is a good example of a native plant that has kind of gone rogue and become invasive. Characteristics of invasive plants: they have many, many seeds. The invasive plants are abundant seed producers. They have rapid population expansion because of those seeds, and also because of rhizomes or stolons often. The seeds tend to be fairly long survivors in the environment. Some native plants like grasses, seeds will only be viable for a year or two if they're left on the soil, whereas other plants like leafy spurge or spotted knapweed, the seeds may last quite a long time in the ecosystem. Leafy spurge is 20 years or so that those seeds would be in the environment. Another characteristic of invasive plants is that they're able to occupy disturbed sites. They benefit from disturbance. They're quite competitive, at least at some time in the year. And then another reason that they are invasive is because they lack natural enemies. These exotic invasive plants came from somewhere else, and most often they left their native enemies back in their homeland. So they left the insects and the diseases and the rusts and the fungi that might have kept them in check back in their homeland. They left those native enemies there, and so they come to our ecosystems without that whole host of enemies. So they're often more competitive with the native plants here. I'm going to ask you to think just a little bit about some of the potential negative and beneficial aspects of weeds. Weeds can have positive effects ecologically. They can also have positive effects socioeconomically. We always focus on the negative impacts and tend to focus on ecological impacts, but also the negative socioeconomic impacts. So think of one or two in all of those lists, and then I'll go over a few. Okay, so hopefully you have at least one in each of those quadrants, and if you printed out the note guides, you can go ahead and keep adding some other ones that I have here in these next few slides. Ecological impact is really, there's a lot of people that understand the ecological impacts. It reduces plant diversity. Yeah, in a way, when you add another species to the ecosystem, that might be increase in diversity, but overall, once these invasive plants get into the community, they tend to reduce the diversity, especially the evenness of the plant community. The plants may still be there, so the species count might be the same, but the abundance of those native species tends to decrease with invasive plants. So plant diversity, but also animal diversity. And not just big signature species like sage grouse or mule deer, but also small little critters that we may not even be able to identify, like grasshoppers and beetles and rodents. So even those smaller animals that we may not even notice, the diversity of them can be highly influenced by invasive plants. Soil integrity. Those plants can they can either break up and go through the soil surface, or they can form really strong mats at the top of the horizon, or especially when a plant community goes from a perennial to an annual plant community, it opens up the soil surface and makes it susceptible to erosion. So we tend to see changes in the nutrient cycling, energy flow, and erosion on ecosystems when invasive plants come in. Not always bad. Usually bad, but not always. Mostly important to just think of it as a change. And then also, when you have those plants come in that use the moisture in the ecosystem differently, it changes the water cycling. So it might change the amount of water that actually is evaporated off the ecosystem, or that comes in the form of precipitation, runoff, infiltration, percolation, and of course transpiration. This is most abundant when you go from a system where you change the complete life form. So if you go from a grassland to a shrubland, or vice versa, if you go from a shrubland to a grassland, you start to see real differences in the water cycle. Socioeconomically, it's going to be beneficial or detrimental. Certainly, people who make a living at weed control, that's a benefit to the environment. That's a benefit to the ecosystem and to individuals, enterprises. Some people make a living on fire suppression. Others make a living on rehabilitation. But there's also some detrimental impacts socioeconomically, such as the loss of opportunities for recreation, such as guiding and such, where recreation is an important economic impact on land. And then also, of course, livestock production, honey production, any other activity that's meant to make an economic benefit. So weeds can be beneficial or detrimental. Recreation losses, as I mentioned, usually weeds make land less useful for recreation, and if that is part of the enterprise level economics, it can surely decrease the gain from that land. Of course, forage production. Yes, some weeds are they do have good forage value. Cheatgrass in the spring is very nutritious and abundant, so it is an important forage source. But overall, there's a loss of the higher beneficial, more productive plants. And so usually we think of invasive species coming in and reducing the forage quality of the ecosystem. I'm going to start to move out towards land management and make a connection between invasion as an ecological process and land management options. And we'll finish off this discussion with sort of where your land management opportunities occur and what sorts of activities could be accomplished. So let's think about this in terms of invasion process. If you start at the lower left-hand corner, it's a time where there is time zero. Very few acres are infected by the weed. You don't even see it. Only a well-trained eye might be able to go across the land and recognize that that weed was there. At that point, in that sort of phase 1 area, is a great time to do that prevention eradication. This is that early detection, rapid response time, where the plant has just occurred and you should use all efforts possible to eradicate it. And then as you start to get more detection, eradication is still feasible. So from the time that a weed is introduced into its detection, early detection, phases 1 and 2 on this graph, we have opportunities to eradicate the plant from the area, and we should make every effort to do that. As the plant goes from just a few locations to many locations in the center of this chart, eradication is unlikely. It would take a lot of effort to do it and a lot of money. As this graph goes up on the y-axis, it's increasing costs and increasing acres affected. So by the time you get to phase 3, area 3, it's getting more and more difficult. You've got to quit thinking about eradication and start thinking about control. And then finally, at level 4, this is at the point where general public starts to see that the weed is there. Then local control and management only is available, so containment and really just looking at each weed on an individual land basis. At that point, the weed at some time reaches its natural biological potential for invasion and slows down. And there's a few weeds that have probably reached their natural extent in the West. As we think about land planning in light of weeds, I really want to emphasize and start with the idea that maintaining a healthy native plant community is really the place to start. You may not need to worry about weeds at all if you maintain a really healthy community that is using the resources that are available. Now, that's not to say that some invasive plants won't get an advantage and sneak in to the system one way or another. But generally there will be slower rates of invasion and slower incidence of invasion if you have a healthy plant community that exists that is using the resources that are available. Once every effort is made to reduce the opportunities for a weed to invade a system, the next step is to focus efforts on prevention and early detection. We're still at that very lowest part of acres infected on the chart, and opportunities for prevention are excellent. So to prevent weeds in land management context, it means that you need to consider vectors of introduction. How might weeds get to the land that you're managing? Is it through recreational vehicles, through other vehicles, through livestock, through wildlife, through other human activities? How might a weed actually make it to the land? Then develop a plan to minimize that introduction, minimize those vectors. And a lot of this means maintaining that healthy plant community and minimizing disturbance, because disturbances usually favor weeds. So every good land manager should have an idea about prevention and really be able to sit down and say, here's a way that new weeds might get onto my land. Early detection then is also really important. Make sure that you know weeds if you're a land manager. Make sure that you have a strategy for looking for them and detecting them early. When you find a weed, make sure you look at other areas that weed might be affecting, and eradicate those plants whenever possible when they're at those low levels of abundance. Part of this, making sure you know where weeds are and how they spread, is a weed survey. A weed survey is just collecting information about the biology, ecology of weeds, and then documenting its requirements so that you know where it might occur on the landscape. So identifying the sites that are susceptible to invasion. And then finally, it's great if you can put those on some sort of a map or a GIS database so that you can evaluate the progress of weed management plans. So, most federal agencies and weed management groups have a real system for knowing where they've put herbicides on, where they've applied biocontrol, where they've done targeted grazing or other practices to minimize weed abundance, and then make sure to go back and see if it worked. All of those activities would be under the second part of land planning for weeds, which is developing a weed survey. Weed mapping is just one set of those weed surveys. Again, it can be done on map or GIS, and basically what you do in a weed map is just delineate the extent of the weeds, document the control activities, and monitor spread over time. So when a control activity occurs, it's important to go back the next year and make sure that the weed is not reoccurring, or to treat it if it is reoccurring. And that's the way to monitor spread of weeds over time. Historically in weed control, there was an era where the amount of spray used or the amount of time invested in weed control was considered a benchmark. Most weed groups have gotten away from that and said, it doesn't matter how much weed spray you use or how much time you spend. What really matters is how many acres you affected. How many acres you affected is determined through weed maps. Now, as we kind of go into the end of this presentation is called Integrated Weed Management. It's really important to remember that no matter what you're doing for weed control, it needs to be integrated with all possible options in the tool bag. The traditional four categories of weed management are chemical, biocontrol, which usually is insects or rusts, and the thing about biocontrol is very specific to an individual plant. Cultural are things like grazing and fire. These are activities that are natural in the landscape, and we use them in very specific ways. I'm sorry, they're not natural. They're activities that are natural but also managed on the landscape, and we can manage them in ways to reduce weeds. Then finally, mechanical. Taking a shovel and digging a weed out of the ground is mechanical. Taking a mower or a harrow out to the ground to reduce weeds, that would be mechanical. So again, chemical, biocontrol, cultural, mechanical. All of those are options. They can work together. You can, for example, use chemicals and follow up with grazing and have a benefit for both the beneficial effect for both the chemical and the goat or the targeted grazing. I mentioned that in the Invasive Species Act, the Noxious Weed Law of 1974, there was emphasis on creating coordinating groups across landscapes. The name for those groups are Coordinated Weed Management Groups, or Management Associations, CWMAs at times. Develop plans across land ownerships. That's the main goal. So people from federal agencies and state agencies all get together, look at maps, and say, well, what do we know is happening out here? Another advantage of these CWMAs or CWMGs is that you can leverage resources, time, equipment, money, expertise. So for example, the agencies might have the equipment. An agency might have the sprayer and the four-wheeler, but they may not have time to use it, whereas the landowner might have time to use it, or they might have the expertise to know where the weeds are on the ground and how to get there. Someone else might not have time or equipment, but they might have money. So by leveraging resources across agency boundaries, we can really start focusing on the weed. In most cases, to apply for state or federal funds for weed management, you have to be part of a coordinated weed management group of some sort. Most agencies won't lend money if all you want to do is kill weeds on your land. And this all comes from the idea that weeds don't care about jurisdictions and legal boundaries. If you want to control weeds, you need to work together. Finally, monitoring and evaluation. Don't ever go out and put a weed plan together and just like all other land management actions, we need to keep seeing if it's working. So was the population suppressed? Was the cost of suppression acceptable? What were the non-target effects? You may have controlled the weed, but what else was impacted on the range? Does it need to be repeated? Should we change it? Do we need to modify the way we did it? What about other land management goals? Were those met also in light of this weed management activity? Finally, take-home message. I talked all about managing weeds. I talked a little bit about integration, but no matter what you do out on the ground, remember, it's not just about the weed. It's not only the weed that's the problem. You might get rid of one weed and have a much larger problem. And in fact, many weeds can be beneficial on the land if they are kept in check. So it's not just about the weed, it's about the land. How healthy is the land? Are your land management goals being met? Is that land management issue being addressed? So it's not about the weed, it's about the land. We are going to go next into a discussion on targeted grazing as one tool to manage lands for weeds.